In reality, Mobile Light Force 2 is a port of the Japanese arcade shooter. Notes the vertical letterboxing. Really makes you feel like you're at the arcade. And really wastes a lot of screen space. How can we put that space to good use? I know! Dance party! The enemies are decidedly, well, Japanese. Rampaging teddy bears, spinning dollies, and giant pulsating brains are only some of the weirdo foes you'll face. Did I mention that it's psychotically hard? How the heck am I supposed to dodge all that crap? Forget it, I'm dying too much anyway. More dancing! Unless you're a masochist with the reflexes of a god, Mobile Light Force 2 is going to bring you nothing but frustration. Nothing more demeaning than getting your butt kicked by some teddygrams. And if you do have godlike reflexes, then you'll finish the game in about half an hour. 5 short levels, and that's all she wrote.
And you'll finish the game in about half an hour. 5 short levels, and that's all she wrote.
To its credit, the game only costs $10. But that's at least, well, it's about $10 too much in my book. We give Mobile Light Force 2 an Angels ripoff anime wannabe headache-inducing 1 out of 5.
Hello everyone, welcome to my monthly Patreon voted review of Castle Shikigami by Alpha System. And as you saw in the intro here, XPlay gave this game a 1 out of 5, so I think we're done here, right? XPlay thinks this game sucks, and when have XPlay ever steered us wrong? But in all seriousness, it irks me to no end every time I open up a Wikipedia page and I see a review from XPlay listed under critical review scores. Let's be real, XPlay are not real video game critics, even by gaming journalism standards.
It's a game where a terrible truth lurks. A place where someone or something is turning heroes into gay heroes. Sweet! Exhibit A, God Hand for the PS2. Everything seems to be in its right place.
Mommy, there's a gay in my game.
Just when you think fighting games are getting a little ho-hum, the Japanese give the old heave-ho to something from their subconscious to ours.
They are not real video game critics. They openly admitted on the show all the time, this is purely for entertainment. We are just saying these things because we think it is funny and edgy and stupid and teenage kids will like it. It's not real video game critique. So I demand justice for Castle Shikigami. Remove that 1 of 5 from XPlay on the Wikipedia page, or I will boycott XPlay until they reverse their decision, which I'm sure will be any day now. So, Castle Shikigami, where do I begin with this game? First of all, let's talk about the presentation, because that's absolutely going to stand out for better or for worse. I think this is going to divide people right away. How do you feel about Castle Shikigami's graphics? Now, I'm personally am pretty damn tolerant to these old school, early 3D style graphics. I quite like a lot of these types of things, but even I have to admit that Castle Shikigami is not exactly a looker, because not only does it have these sort of primitive 3D graphics and models, but they're not really well matched together in a coherent visual style. They don't blend so well. It feels like Mugen before Mugen was a thing, where they've got one thing going along with the background, and then they got another thing going along with one enemy type, and then they have another enemy type on screen, and they don't really match all that much. The bosses don't have a coherent visual theme between them. They just seem to be sort of putting together models and just dropping them in the game, and they're like, hey, this works, right? Also, with the coloring and everything, it just does not have a consistent visual style at all. But I think this is one of those things where you either look at it and you say, no way, this is a turnoff, I'm not going to deal with this, or you're like oddly charmed, like I am with Mugen. When I look at Mugen games, often I have no right to like the way that they look, but I can't help myself. So I'd say right off the bat, the visual presentation of Castle Shikigami is not exactly its strong suit. I think the backgrounds especially need more differentiation from the foreground because things blend into the background a little bit too much, and it really does feel, because there's no like perspective shading and stuff like that you're just on top of like a green screen going underneath you. I think they could have done a little bit better job adding, depth and that type of stuff with the background, and also dimming it a little more so the bullets stand out. So the game is not going to be winning any prizes in the graphics department. Though I will say, I think the strongest aspect of the graphical presentation are the character models, the flying humanoids. I really like this. So we have Esperade, we have Touhou, and Castle Shikigami. There's probably some other ones out there, but I really like shmups that have flying humanoid characters because I feel like it's easier to connect with them. I think it's a little bit easier to market them as well. I think this is the magic of Rico flying around on the bug. I think if the game was just the bug, it would not be as compelling as having this human character attached to the bug, and the fact that you can see her really works really well. And I think the same thing here with Castle Shikigami. The characters being able to be played directly, I really like that, and I think they did a pretty cool job with the animation. Though I will say, because the animation, they're kind of tilting and bending and stuff, the hitbox is a little bit difficult to keep track of at times throughout the animation. But what's interesting is I believe it is possible that Castle Shikigami is the first shmup to come up with the concept of the visible hitbox. We're not confirmed on that, but it predates the Touhou game that does it, and it also predates Mushihime-sama, so it is quite possible that Castle Shikigami is the first shmup to have a visible hitbox, which will of course be a staple of bullet hell design from this point forward, really. And my theory is part of the reason for that is not only because the grazing mechanic, which we'll talk about in a bit here, but also because of the character animations. And they're like, hey, we kind of need to help you out knowing where the hitbox is during the animations, so let's actually show you. So that's my theory, but it's a really nice visual touch. It really helps out, especially with the bullet grazing. Though I will say I don't think they fully thought through how they want to represent the hitbox, because for most characters it works well enough. But the Reimu girl character, since she's wearing a white shirt, the white hitbox just blends into it way too well. I suppose you can change her color, but if you want the Reimu white-red outfit, yeah, you're not going to be able to see the hitbox all that well. I think in that case, they should have changed the hitbox to like black or red or something to make it a little bit more stand out. There's a lot of things like that in Castle Shikigami, actually, where the idea is there, it's a really cool concept, but the execution is a little funky. Another example of that is the border of the Playfield. So what I'm saying is, I'm not talking about the borders on the side of the screen that you look at, like with the art and everything. I'm saying the borders of the Playfield, where if you go to the left side of the screen, mostly what happens in bullet hells is that part of your character sprite goes off screen when you go all the way to the edges, because what stops you is your hitbox, not your sprite. But in Castle Shikigami, it is actually your sprite that stops you. So you stop earlier on the sides of the border than I think you should. It should be your hitbox taking you to the sides, not the actual outline of your character. But for whatever reason, for whatever programming reason, you can't go that far into the corners. And the reason why this is an issue is if you've played a million other shmups that do this, what's often going to happen when you're in clutch dodge scenarios is you're going to try to squeeze around a bullet like you normally would, but you can't because your character can't go all the way to the side. An even worse problem, though, is the bottom border, the gutter down there, because normally, again, you can get to the bottom of the playfield, and sometimes, like Dodonpachi, but Dodonpachi does this. Sometimes shmups will have this sort of bomb bar down there or some sort of bar down there that's built into the game, but it's still visually represented with a border. This game, Castle Shikigami, it has this sort of gutter area that you can't enter, but it has no visual indication of where that gutter area is. You just stop flying way before you actually reach the bottom of the screen, and I'm not saying that they couldn't have this gutter area, because basically what they do with it is in some stages they have enemies fly around in this area behind you. So I'm thinking they're trying to want to make this area inaccessible to you so that you don't ram into these enemies flying below you. The problem with that, though, is they should add some sort of line of demarcation in some way to let you know, okay, this is the bottom gutter. Like, they could have darkened it a bit. They could have actually added a literal line like Dangan Feveron Arrange does. Just something, some kind of visual indication to know, oh, this is the gutter down here, don't come down here. What I had to do is I had to take a piece of paper and I had to just tape it across my monitor so I wouldn't look down there, because I kept dodging into the gutter and then stopping and getting killed. A lot of my deaths came from that, and it was really frustrating. So I really wish they would have done something with that area of the playfield to not make it just guesswork where it ends, so that, you're not running into it in weird ways. So that's the visuals of the game, and I think an obvious comparison that comes to mind, especially with the flying humanoid characters, is with Touhou, because Castle Shikigami and Touhou seem to have quite a bit in common with one another, and one of them being is how they present their visuals, because you get the feeling that both of these games don't exactly have that much of a budget when it comes to graphics, and they're kind of working with what they have. But I think between the two, it's pretty undeniable in my opinion that Zun did a better job, even if you don't like the little flying girl moe styling of Touhou. Zun did a better job of creating effects and creating kind of iconic visuals that, even though they're not super well drawn and the backgrounds are kind of strange most of the time, what I think Zun was able to do with Touhou is he added in iconic effects and kind of worked with the limitations that he had. Like whenever you enter boss fights where you get like the spinning, rotating backgrounds, the shifts in color, the shifts in animation. He basically tried his best to make the graphics work with the limited resources he had. And I think that works better than the way Castle Shikigami does it, which is it has these sort of just static, uninteresting, bland 3D backgrounds that you scroll across, but there's not a real strong sense of style or flair. Ironically, I think the best looking stage of this game is one of the last stages, which looks like a Touhou stage, where it has the kind of dark purple background. I think that stage looks better than the earlier stages, and at that point on that stage, the comparison to Touhou is really hard not to make because they look so much alike, especially if you're playing the Reimu character. And speaking of stages, let's talk about the boss fights, because they are certainly a highlight of the game and probably my favorite aspect of Shikigami when it comes to the gameplay, because even though the bosses themselves look a bit odd in their visual design, when it comes to their gameplay design, their mechanics, they are a lot of fun, and I think rather well done, especially when you mix it in with the grazing mechanic of the game, because unlike grazing mechanics of most other shmups, you're not just limited to grazing the enemy bullets, you can actually graze the enemy sprites. And because the way the grazing mechanic in this game works, where you get bonus damage and bonus firepower when you graze enemies and graze enemy bullets, this means that it often sets up a meta with the boss fights that kind of reminds me of the technical kills in Psycho, where you can get up and you can get right underneath the boss and speed kill them in the most daring, badass way possible. And it actually requires a lot of knowledge of how the boss is going to move and what the boss is going to do. And in doing so, you are rewarded with a ton of extra coins and points, which I think segues very nicely into talking about the scoring system of Castle Shikigami, because in my opinion, first impressions of this game are a bit misleading. And yes, you can blame the player a bit in that regard. Maybe if more players were willing to investigate the scoring systems of shmups, more people would be aware of how cool Shikigami can be. But also, I think, as a critic of game design, that the game could have done a bit of a better job leading the player through the survival gameplay into thinking about the scoring and how the scoring works, and I'll explain why that is. Because when you first fire up Castle Shikigami and play it, so most average shmup players, even people familiar with the genre, you're going to play it like a Touhou game or like a cave game for the most part, where you're going to be hanging back on the screen, making smart moves, smart dodges, giving yourself lots of time and space to react to things. And if you play Castle Shikigami that way, it can be pretty fun. You have to power yourself up in stage 1, but from that point forward, you can actually play the game that way somewhat effectively. The thing is, though, is that it starts to feel a little stale and a little bit underwhelming. And that was my first impression of Castle Shikigami until I spoke to fans of it, of course, and they explained to me, well, the game really comes alive when you engage in the scoring meta of the game. And that's because the scoring meta of the game is quite different from how it looks on the surface. So what you do when you score in Castle Shikigami, from what I understand, I'm not going to go over the nitty-gritty of points and coins and everything, but the general game plan seems to be is that you fly up, you play incredibly aggressively, you speed kill things, and the faster you speed kill things, it seems the more points you're getting. And then if you watch the high level replays of the game, they are aggressively bullet grazing, like way more aggressively than I've seen in perhaps any other game, how aggressive the bullet grazing of this game is. And it seems to be a whole different dynamic. So if you watch a survival run versus a scoring run, the scoring run is almost like a speed run because of how fast things are getting killed and how much more firepower because of the grazing. However, as cool as that is, I think what Castle Shikigami could have done that would have made the game a lot more coherent to the average player base is if they integrated this style of gameplay into their survival gameplay a little bit better. For example, it has these timers at the top, and if you're playing for score, I'm sure those timers have certain significance to you because you need to hit certain time metrics and score metrics and everything. But if you're playing for survival, that timer, it's not really all that relevant to you. You don't really worry about it all that much, except maybe on the final boss or something, but in the actual stages themselves, you've got plenty of time. You're never really concerned about that timer. But what if they went in and made those timers much more strict so that the average player needs to start engaging in the meta of the scoring simply to survive? I think some of the best shmups, in my opinion, are always shmups that are able to integrate their scoring and survival really elegantly. I think this is the biggest hole when it comes to Castle Shikigami's design, because based on how many people are passionate about this game's scoring and how long this game's scoring has held up over time, it seems that the scoring system itself is very strong. It's just a question of, can the game help lead the average player into appreciating the scoring system? Because if it doesn't, it is relying on a niche of a niche to explain how good the game is. And I think part of that comes from the fact that it has an arcade legacy. And this is something, as a reviewer, I'm trying to be less biased about, because we tend to have a more forgiving bias towards older arcade games because we already know how they function and we already know that the games are good and have held up over the test of time. But if Castle Shikigami was sent to me by an indie shmup developer and they said, hey, what are your thoughts on the game? The first thing I would start to talk about is, okay, but there seems to be a disconnect here between the scoring and the survival gameplay, and maybe this disconnect could be tightened up. And so I think it is fair to also bring this critique up with Castle Shikigami. It's not a mortal flaw or anything like that. I'm not saying the game's 1 out of 5 like X-Play, but I think with some more clear guidance to the player, more people would connect with Castle Shikigami. And for all I know, this could have been improved upon in the sequels, so I'm very curious to see how the sequels actually handle this issue, and maybe with the sequels they do a better job of integrating their scoring and survival. I haven't played them yet. I'm kind of saving that for when I review them, but that's something I'm going to be paying attention to. And then following up that critique, another issue I'd like to talk about is the pacing of the game, because when you have enemies on screen and when you have bosses on screen, I think the pacing of the game is perfectly fine. It's a lot of fun, especially at the end. It really starts to ramp up and get you going. But for some reason, in between the stages and the bosses, there is a lot of dead air in this game. There are a lot of sections of this game where you're just flying over an empty background or an empty screen, or with certain bosses, they have this phase where the boss comes in and takes a languid, leisurely stroll on screen where, sure, cool the first time, but the 500th time, even the 50th time, especially if you're playing this game for score, imagine you're playing the game for score, you're trying to race against the clock and get all these sweet speed kills on bosses, and yet for them to get on the screen, it takes forever. It would be funny to see if it takes longer for some of these bosses to get on screen than it does to actually kill them. And there's a lot of empty sections like this for no reason. And another thing too is that I don't mind that the game has a bunch of little mini stages, sort of like Radiant Silvergun, but I wish the game would hurry the pace up between these mini stages. So now let's talk about character balance. As I said earlier, one of my favorite aspects of this game visually are the characters. I think they all look pretty cool, and I do appreciate how they are all very different from each other. Not only in their appearance, but in the way they actually play, because they have different shots, they have different Shikigamis, and they have different bombs. So they are entirely different in almost every way, at least as far as a shmup is concerned. And what's interesting about this is there's kind of two ways to view character balance in shmups. I think there's the cave score play style of viewing it, where in an ideal world, in like the perfect Brood War scenario, you basically get all the different ship types being able to equivalently get pretty close world record scores to each other. So yes, there's probably some slight difference between Type A and Type B in DOJ, but for the most part, their score potential is pretty equivalent, and it's just going to come down to the player's style and skill to make the records. I think that is very admirable and very cool, and I generally support that style of design. However, I'm not opposed to another style of character balance, which we see here in Castle Shikigami. Now, I don't know if this is intentional or not, but from what I've observed, the character balance of Castle Shikigami is a bit more varied, where it seems like some characters really excel in survival, and then other characters really excel in score, and sometimes they actually don't line up all the way, which I think is really interesting. So Kuga, for example, the Japanese schoolboy, he seems to be a very good survival character. So if you want to get a 1cc of this game and get it with the least amount of effort and trouble, it seems like he would be a great selection for that, because the way his Shikigami works, where it just auto homes in on things for you and you're able to kind of sit back and chill and fight from a distance. And then complementing that is the girl character Seo, or Reimu as I will refer to her, where when you play her for survival, she's actually quite difficult because her Shikigami attack is incredibly slow movement speed wise, and the attack range of it is also very limited. And so when you're playing in the later stages and you die with her, it's terrifying because you can run into some real Gradius syndrome type things, because it's actually very difficult to rebuild up your power level and your score with her Shikigami unless you really know what you're doing. And so naturally, if you're going for a survival 1cc, I don't know if she's the best character to choose, at least for people newer to the game and the game's systems. But ironically, when I look up the world record scores, it's actually inverted, where Kuga, he's kicking some ass in terms of survival, but his scoring potential seems much more limited, whereas Reimu, she seems to be really struggling for survival, at least for new players. But when you look at her score, she is actually the highest scoring character. So I think that is a very fascinating style of design, and I don't know if it was intentional, but I think it can actually work and be really cool, especially if you're really invested in Castle Shikigami and you really love Castle Shikigami. I could see someone actually taking the effort to learn all the different characters and to learn all the scoring meta for all the different characters, because the way their individual Shikis work really change the way they play in terms of their routing and their scoring options. And because the characters are also different and are also balanced differently, I could see it being really attractive, almost like little built-in arrange modes. And so in that regard, I think the character balance of the game is interesting and perhaps quite effective. Personally, my favorite character of the game is Unknown, the question mark girl. I love her lock-on style Shiki attack, and then she just seems hella good with her homing shot. So she just seems like a very powerful but interesting character to play. And so if I ever go for a formal 1cc of the game, this is probably the character I will use. She also looks super cool. And so to close out this review, let's talk about the Steam port. Okay, so the Steam port is kind of interesting because in one regard it is quite solid, and in another regard it is quite jank. So let's begin with the jank. The janky part of the Steam port is when I downloaded this game, it wouldn't launch. Off of Steam. Steam would not launch this game. I didn't know what to do. I looked around on the internet. I couldn't find any sort of helpful advice. I looked into the folder. It said, this type of file is missing. I messaged Bog. Bog, what do you think this is? And he hunted down some open source sound driver that I needed. And so I did manage to get the game launched eventually, but I had to use an open source sound driver to get it to launch. And this is on 2 different computers, mind you. So I don't know if this is like a newer issue that everyone is going to experience, or if it was like an issue unique to my purchase of the game. That was not a great first impression. Another issue I was having with the game is I liked how the port had more quality of life features like full screen and controller config, and it could read my controller. A lot of shmup ports struggle with that sort of stuff. But when I was playing in full screen, at least on my desktop, the full screen seemed to be fighting with my operating system, or something was going on where about every minute or so, the full screen would start to flicker and I would lose control for a few frames and then it'd flicker back in. So I don't know if my graphics card was pissed off at the full screen function or what, but that was an issue to the point where I actually had to play the game in windowed mode, which I never do unless I have to. So I'm sure this is something that is solvable, but again, the port is just really rough around the edges, both in terms of its presentation and its performance. But in terms of the actual core performance, input lag wise, it felt pretty damn responsive and I was quite pleased with that. So I don't think it is a laggy port, which is a relief, but it seems a little bit fussy. The graphics of the Steam port are a little bit off, even by Shikigami standards, because it is forcing sharpening, and actually doing this does not seem to be a good idea, because at least based off screenshots that I've seen, it looks like without the sharpening filter, the graphics do fit together a little bit better. It seems to be like if you really sharpen it up, that shows the edges of the game. Quite literally, in fact, sometimes you can actually see the edges of the backgrounds and the background models and stuff. And so, yeah, it was probably not the best idea to apply this sharpening filter. I assume the reason why they did that is because they sat around and said, okay, we gotta make this game look better somehow. But they probably went backwards and actually made the game worse, so that would be nice if they could allow you to turn off this filter in some fashion, but from what I understand, this is not possible. If there's some sort of hack or some sort of crazy way to do it, just feel free to message me about it in the comments and I'll pin it. And so what are my final thoughts on Castle Shikigami? Well, I think it is fair to say that Castle Shikigami is a niche within a niche. And so if you are brand new to the genre of shmups, you're just getting your feet wet, you're just getting started, this probably is not going to be the game for you. Now, we all have different tastes, and maybe this could line up with exactly your tastes if you're a new player, but I think generally speaking, Castle Shikigami is not a shmup that brings in new players. Instead, I think the audience that Castle Shikigami very much appeals to are players who are already interested in scoring systems and who want to find a unique and engaging scoring system. And Castle Shikigami certainly delivers that, especially with the unique approach it takes to enemy and bullet grazing, where it wants you to fly right up next to bosses and enemy sprites and to just fire blast them in the face point blank, and then after they shoot bullets at you, to not only graze the bullets, but to follow the bullets across the screen. That is something you do not typically see in shmups, even grazing shmups. It is one thing to be playing Touhou and to see a bullet fly by and to graze it for a little bit of extra meter. It is quite another thing to watch these Castle Shikigami players actually chase the bullets across the screen. They're not even dodging bullets anymore, they're chasing them and just riding up alongside them. And then of course the really cool animation of the hitbox when you're grazing and the massive power boost that is obvious and exciting. I can see why the game's scoring system is so addictive and cool. I just wish the game did a little bit of a better job incentivizing all players to play that way rather than incentivizing just the people who are already interested in scoring. So overall, Castle Shikigami is the classic tale of a shmup with a lot of thoughtful and forward-thinking design when it comes to its gameplay, but it's not exactly putting its best foot forward in terms of graphical presentation and art style. And so unfortunately, it is one of those games that if you are not someone who's paying attention to the mechanics and design of the genre, which is 99% of reviewers and the vast majority of people who don't play shmups, then this game will absolutely get dunked on. So it didn't surprise me at all that XPlay gave the game a 1 out of 5. But I wanted to point out the XPlay review because yes, there's a lot of talk about how unfairly XPlay and a lot of these Western journalists of the time treated RPGs and JRPGs. I even made a whole video about the whole controversy about how mean they were to JRPGs, which is fair, but they're also quite mean to shmups, as you will see. So, you know, what about shmups? What about the poor arcade games? They were getting dunked on perhaps even harder than Japanese RPGs. And so, yeah, like I said in the beginning of the review, I will not rest until XPlay retract their horrible review and replace it with a much more accurate and fair review. And I'm sure that'll be coming any day now.
So thank you to the $5 patrons, 100, Accepting Panda, Admiral Coconut, Arnold, Alexander Pfeiffer, Dingo, Anthony A, Arcade Hell, Arrow Viper, Bean Pit, Bo, Ben, Vito Dames, Borgie22, Brian Romano, Brian Shiver, Bush and Cat, Chase Palumbo, Chattel Maltese, Chris Yusufovich, Chronic Burnout 3, Clara Cliff, Climby Coyote, Coast, Colorboy, Cookstand666, Cooks and Soup, Corey Mark, Des Audio, Dan Chi, Darren Griffin, Dave Hansen, David Crespo, Delta Tango 6, Disco Stas Leia, DJ420 Praise It, Elias, FCK, Frames Per Human, Francisco, Full Set, Retro Schmupper, Hausu, Jake Ryan, J-Lab, JB RPG, John Kelly, Game Boy Guru, K, K2, Kilo Reedy, Contain, Praise the Boys, K-Horse, Low Casting, Malaise, Matt O'Leary, Maz, Megadeth 859, Minong, Mecklin, Michael McCord, Mitchell Y, Queen Charlene, Nathaniel Davis, Neon Dagger Games, Oakland Kugels, Oxated, Pedro, Philip Mason, Psycho Blizzard, Rattlecat, Raul, Real Skeen, Riff Mason, Rolf015, Scanline City, Seesaw FW, Shmup Junkie, Sarah Pong, Steve Fiction, Street Magic, Superfunk, SW1335, Temzarian, Takara Mucho, Taze, The Boot Rex, The Dirty Screech, The N1, The Old Bensta, TRM, Sugumo, 2YU, Twilight EX, Unikoi Roots, Bog Hog, Vic Viper, Beautiful, Wabby Legs, Utakaya, Zachary Patton, Zeal. Thanks so much, everyone.